Hello there. Today I'm going to talk about Light and Magic, the new documentary all about ILM that Lawrence Kasdan, the director, did. And Kasdan's in a lot of films with Lucasfilm, but a lot of films outside Lucasfilm. He started off as a screenwriter, and two of his big films were Empire Strikes Back and Raiders of the Lost Ark as a writer. He wrote both of them, worked with George Lucas. He came back and did Return of the Jedi, even though he started directing at that point with the Body Heat. And then he moved on and did his first kind of films like Silverado, Wyatt Earp, Accidental Tourist. He's more of a character-based, eccentric character director, more than a blockbuster guy. But he was in with George Lucas, and he created a good team with Lucas because Lucas was good at the big picture and Kasdan was good at the small character details. So they were a good team because they filled in what each other person wasn't so good at, which is one of the strengths of the Star Wars original trilogy. Is Lucas was actually very good at bringing in people who were good at stuff he wasn't so good at. And Kasdan, I think he's more or less retired from fiction films now. I don't know that, or he just can't get certain films made anymore. I don't know. But he's made a documentary about Industrial Light and Magic. And what's good about this documentary is it's more about the start of it and in the 80s and early 90s than it is about what it is now. It covers what it is now a little, but it's not... You can tell that's not where the interest is in this thing. It's actually about how the film industry needed this at a certain time and how it evolved through time. And it's about the people involved and all the ILM people who... You may have seen the names up on the screen, but you might not know that much about them beyond, yeah, they've said they have a genius, that kind of thing. And what the good thing with the documentary is, George Lucas is in it, but he doesn't dominate it. He does it. He tells you his point of view, but he also talks about the different practical side of things to try and get these things done, and what the practical reasons were for starting it, continuing it, evolving it, moving to CGI. It gives you a full idea of the development of special effects. It's really over like the first 20-25 years, and then after that it's like these other things happen, but it's not as interesting to them. It's about the early stages and the slow development. So effects were in a kind of slow turnaround, really. There was films like 2001 which perfected special effects at the time, and they did certain things with the effects and all the experts. Then in the early 1970s, you had a lot of stuff with matte paintings and things, but there wasn't that much effects work. And a lot of effects studios were getting shut down because there wasn't any need for them anymore. Like a lot of the 60s fantasy-based films or TV shows weren't happening. So whenever you did an effects movie, it was much harder because there was effects departments in certain studios, but a lot of time they were getting cut down because there wasn't films for them. And then Star Wars happened. I mean, Star Wars was a piece of a time that it came at a time when everyone was getting shut down effects-wise, so they had to bring in people who were like the new people. People who had a little bit of experience, but they were the new people who had been working in advertising, had been working in small studios, who all had talent, and they all knew each other, because everyone had each other's phone numbers. So one of the big things was, that George Lucas was planned on, was hire the top guy who knows everybody, and they'll hire the other people because they know them, they have the phone numbers. Which was a really smart move. It was like, one thing you actually get from this film is, this TV show is, that Lucas was actually pretty smart about in his tactic. It was like, I don't need to know everything. I need to know what I can get done. I need to hire the right people who actually know all this stuff, and I can leave them to get on with it. And I can explain what I need, and they can work out the logistics of doing it. And that's what the thing is. You start with John Dykstra, and you see what's good about Dykstra. He knows everybody, and he knows all the details of all the talented people. But he's also a camera technician, so he knows how to perfect something. But also shows you the downside of him. Is like in the documentary, as they were saying, like for the producers, he wasn't doing as much shots early on as he needed to. But from his point of view, it was like he needed to get the camera setups done work first, and then the shots could happen. It would take time to get. It would take a lot longer to do the motion control cameras ready for this film. So the first episode and a half is about the making of effects for Star Wars and the effect of Star Wars on the industry and who these people were who came up, like Dennis Muren and all these other people who were involved in the Joe Johnson. There's another guy whose name I forget now, but he was always Ken Ralston, who did a lot of Zemeckis films later on, and he was also in LA. So all these people come in, they were known by Dykstra, and they all had skills, and everybody was doing 3 or 4 jobs always on the films, and can you do this, can you do that? Like Joe Johnson came in he was doing painting stuff sometimes, then he would do storyboards for George Lucas, so he could jump in various departments. Phil Tippett came in later on and said, well, you don't really need me. Then he realised they needed certain things that he was good at, and then they also needed me to do these stop motion stuff for 1 or 2 sequences. So there's these little bits and bobs, so he get introduced slowly into the way of doing it as well. So there was this sense of everybody was inventing things. And it was difficult. It was one of those things that was difficult because I'd set the cameras up and get the cameras equipment ready and built. Because, I mean, the cameras were built for Star Wars. The motion control cameras were built for Star Wars. I mean, Dykstra was getting paid to build these cameras and then do the effects. But when they came back from shooting, the very few effects had been done. The effects that had been done were good, but it was like, when George Lucas actually had an anxiety attack and he thought he was going to have a heart attack, they took him to hospital. He's like, no, you have just an anxiety attack. Relax. And then eventually they actually brought in people who could organise it, but they realised the big problem was organisation. So they brought in people who could organise it. You do this, you do that. And they could take the stress off Dykstra, who could just focus on getting the jobs done, and somebody else would start organising the schedules a lot more, so it was simpler to get shots, this shot, this shot, this shot, this shot. And then we also try to think of various ways to do the shots, because it's fake shots, everyone thinks, oh, it's easy, one thing works all, and it's like, no, it's a magic trick. And a lot of magic tricks need different elements for different shots to make the magic trick work. So you always reinvent yourself in effects to actually make it work. So the film is about that, it's about the magic trick element of special effects, the human element of people who were brought up in this and who had ambitions to this. They were all kind of geeky, they were all very ambitious, they were ambitious about stuff that no one else understood. But luckily Star Wars happened and they actually managed to find a way to use their talents. I mean, Joe Johnson was probably the least geeky because he was into like industrial design and things, and he was just, it was work, but he was very good at a lot of stuff because he had a lot of technical skill. The other ones were more geekier and they actually were just doing what they could. So it takes up Star Wars. Then there's after Star Wars, after the film's finished, the film comes out and it's a big hit. And now studios are wanting to make new Star Wars stuff, and Lucas wants to make a new Star Wars film. But for the special effects people, there's no work, because they're going to have to wait till the next Star Wars film is written, and then they get hired. So a lot of them go off and do Battlestar Galactica for John Dykstra. And the interesting thing behind this documentary is that they use this motion control stuff from Star Wars on Battlestar Galactica. Even though this was a rip-off, and even though there was a lawsuit about the legalities of it, Lucas let them use the equipment that he'd got using the budget to pay for this other thing, and he let them use them to keep them work while they were writing Star Wars Part 2, which is Empire Strikes Back. Which is a nice little story you don't expect. So when an Empire Strikes Back was set up, Lucas found that a lot of the people like Dennis Muren, Ken Ralston, Joe Johnson, all those people you get on with a lot better and found them a lot easier to deal with than John Dykstra, who'd won the Oscar for Star Wars. So he brought all of them and Phil Tippett and things like that, all these other people involved. He brought all of them over to ILM, offered a lot of them a job, and they all came to ILM for Empire Strikes Back. Dykstra wasn't invited back, I think it was just a case of it was such a difficult process of doing those effects. I think it was just a case of I can't go through that with him again. And the part in the Empire Strikes Back was a much harder film to do than Star Wars. Much more ambitious, much more difficult. They had much more ambitious matte paintings and much more ambitious stop motion stuff and lots more ambitious background to foreground space shots. You've got the asteroid belt things, which took a lot of time to do because there was passes of different layers of asteroids and through the frame. So it was a much more difficult process. It took forever to do. But because the people were there from Star Wars and they were all trying to develop the skills, not just do the same thing again, which was the same as the film itself, everybody wanted to try something different. And so then basically they made the film. And it worked really well. And everybody suddenly had a much better appreciation for their own skills and other people's skills, and people were finding their feet a lot more in this one than they were. And people were, that's because they weren't under Dykstra anymore, the leaders were starting to come to the fore from various different departments. I mean, it's not to say Dykstra was horrible, he was, and you'd see a very human person with Dykstra too. It's just that in Star Wars he was a guy, and in Empire Strikes Back's office there were 3 or 4 guys who were leading different departments, and it was working much more than what George Lucas wanted. So he was dealing with people who he'd got on with Star Wars, basically. Then, after that's finished, Lucas knows he wants to do Return of the Jedi, and he also is going to do Raiders of the Lost Ark. So he starts to build a company towards actually having other projects that they can use to keep them in business. So ILM is more or less created out of that need, because George Lucas has friends like Spielberg who need effects shots. Matthew Robbins, who's doing Dragon Slayer, needs effects shots. And Dragon Slayer still gets some great effects shots, even though it's not really seen much anymore. So they went to Raiders Lost Ark. They went Dragon Slayer. Then they started to do stuff outside of their own friend circle and did things like Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan. Because the first Star Trek was way over budget in effects. So the second one they brought in ILM, and ILM did effects, and it was much more producible. So at that point ILM were doing something like Star Trek 2, doing something like Poltergeist for Spielberg and E.T. We're starting to get the reputation as being very good effects shots and also understand their budget. Which is filmed into the idea of they'd understood budgets and different supervisors get different films suddenly because they'd all proved themselves in Empire. And they're starting to have different supervisors who understood, well, this amount of money for this film, this amount of money for this film, how do we stretch a budget to make it work? Then eventually they come back and do Return of the Jedi, and that's where some of them have burned out after that. Some of them start to think, okay, well that's the end of the Star Wars trilogy, what have we got to do now? And the film goes into the idea of like people like Richard Edlund, who was very involved with the production of the Star Wars films. But he was a guy who was experienced even before Star Wars. He was in, and he was a guy who would actually come out and do other great films. Like he left Lucasfilm and ILM after Return of the Jedi, then went straight to Ghostbusters and did 2010. And he did a bunch of really cool films. You know, Joe Johnson went back to school and became a director, and was recommended by George Lucas to do How I Shot the Kids, and he's a big career after that. Dennis Muren adjusted to actually start to investigate CGI at the early stages because he wanted that challenge as well. And the second half of the documentary is about basically is following on from Star Wars to Empire Strikes Back and becoming an industry of different supervisors and learning how to do things, and the various people who became involved, different makeup people who evolved into CGI people, and this whole sense of like the industry changing, but it's an industry change that had been planned for from the start, and this, you know, by Lucas, because he thought you needed computer stuff to actually do certain things you couldn't do before. He wanted to do the prequel trilogy, but he says he couldn't do it the way he did Star Wars. It was too big for what he was planning. And then slowly they started to figure out, like, they brought in people like John Knoll, who developed Photoshop. They brought in a lot of other computer guys who were into their thing, and so they started off doing things like the water tentacle in the abyss, doing morphing from different images, using the models and morphing between them for Willow, and learning how to do that. And slowly but surely they were bringing it together. Then the big kick up, the first big kick up was T2, where you had a character walking, the T1000 walking through and doing all these different things, CGI. It was only like 30 shots, but it took a long time to do these 30 shots. And in between those shots, James Cameron used other types of techniques to hide it too. Then Jurassic Park came out, and it was meant to be stop motion. And they thought they could do it in CGI, and they actually did this small two-person thing and do a shot or two in CGI to see if it worked. And it turned out it really worked, and it was like, okay, we can do a lot more with this, and you couldn't stop motion. But they'd already done a lot of stop motion work then, and they actually set up all the storyboards in stop motion. So what they did was they actually, in Jurassic Park, a lot of what they actually did was they take the stop motion stuff that Phil Tippett had done and replicate in CGI, because they could do more realistic stuff in CGI. But a lot of the animal movements were stuff that the stop motion people had done. And what happened was the Phil Tippett people, stop motion people, taught the CGI artists how to make things move and give it weight. And while at the same time they were learning how to do CGI. So both sides were teaching each other. And that's why so many of the 1990s CGI holds up. It's because a lot of the people, it was a mix between CGI tech and stop motion animators. When Phil Tippett left ILM after Return of the Jedi, and he'd done stuff like RoboCop and RoboCop 2 and a bunch of stuff with Verhoeven and John Davidson. And so when he came back, he had a lot more experience, and what he could do was teach these guys how to actually give weight to the characters, and he could actually animate. So what he did, so all CGI is very much based on, it's been an extension of stop motion. All the techniques are based on stop motion, but they're more advanced. You need a lot more people vendors doing it, but it's an extension of stop motion. And then Tippett then did the next big step beyond Jurassic Park with Starship Troopers, which was thousands of them, and rendering all that stuff to make that sense of this epic battle going on with all these, which was a massive thing for what would come later on with like Lord of the Rings, which wasn't ILM, but they were taking what had been done with Starship Troopers and Jurassic Park. I mean, Starship Troopers wasn't ILM fully either, but each thing was building to the next thing, which then led to Star Wars prequels, which was much more CGI based. And the whole thing of this documentary is how the development slowly happened, how people moved from one thing to the other, and how there still is model shops and stuff. They still do things, they still model things on, like physically to work out the weighting of how things look. It's just it's done less now. Much more done on the computer. But you actually, you'll see any documentaries of even the prequels, they still model stuff and then took the CGI to give it some sort of weight. And then since then, it's become a mass-producing industry that becomes less and less realistic. Like you actually can look at 90s CGI, and there's a lot more personality to it than there is nowadays. There's more. They were trying to make sure it was foolproof. So even though they did less technology, they actually had more artistry. And you had people like Phil Tippett and Des Muren, who are very close friends, you find out in this documentary, like leading the charge to make sure both sides worked. So that's another thing this documentary is really good at. I mean, it's really good at the early part of ILM. The middle part is becoming an industry, and then this changeover, they actually get into a lot of detail how the changeover happened, and slowly, and who are the people who are really important to it. Because, I mean, if you look at most reports, it was all the geniuses at ILM did it, and it was like, no, they brought in people who knew what they're doing, and they realised people they'd worked with before were the key to bringing them to the future. And now basically everyone does computer graphics now, which is now a problem because there's too much of it. But that's basically the documentary. It's about the evolution of special effects over time. and how they're still basically a tool, but the industry now uses them for everything. And how a lot of times they're invisible, and a lot of projects they are invisible now. And the effects guys are now pretty proud when you don't notice their effects, because the intent was you don't know their effects. It's just the show-offy stuff you know their effects, but the rest of the stuff you don't. It's like nowadays you can't wow people with special effects, you have to have a story. A lot of films still try to wow people with special effects, but it doesn't work the same way anymore. I don't think it's quite as good as it used to be honest. It's more of a volume and less of small details that you kind of need. So, this is a terrific documentary. I mean, it doesn't go into the most depth as some of the more, like, tech people might want, but it gives you the human story of all these people. It gives you the depth you need for an average viewer for understanding why certain things took place. And the good thing is, as I said before, they don't focus on George Lucas. He's in at the early parts, and then he's later on, he's less, and he says, I just manage the business. I don't even like computers. Which is the funny thing, is he's rubbish at computers. And he knows people who aren't rubbish with computers, and he lets them do the tech stuff, and he kind of gets what he needs from it. So it's a really terrific documentary. 6 parts, so it doesn't run on too long. It's paced well. There's not that much fat on it. There's a couple of bits in the middle that could have been lost, or the other bits could have been into more detail about. But it is what it is. It's still a really good documentary. I mean, you can do that. Anything that's 6 hours long, you're going to say, I wish I'd done more than that and less than that. That's just the nature of the beast. So I hope you enjoyed this. I'll be back soon with something else. Bye for now.